According to the military analytical channel, Military Summary, Russian forces have carried out a series of massive attacks on key energy facilities in Ukraine over the course of 3 consecutive nights, including once again the large refinery near Kremenchuk on the banks of the Dnipro. At the same time, observers along the front line report that Russian units are advancing in several hotspots and that intense house-to-house fighting is developing in regions such as Seversk, Kostiantynivka, and parts of the Zaporizhzhia area. The Ukrainian army leadership warns that the combination of continuous shelling, precise strikes against energy and supply structures, and simultaneous pressure along a broad front is pushing its own reserves to the limits of endurance. While air raid sirens are sounding in the greater Kyiv area and in numerous southern and eastern regions, military-affiliated sources speak of the most tense situation in months and point to the risk of local collapses of individual defensive lines. Meanwhile, experts emphasize that the nighttime attacks are not only aimed at tactical targets, but also at overwhelming the Ukrainian command and destabilizing crucial supply corridors. In Kyiv, people are already speaking of a critical turning point as several Russian advances could undermine the existing defensive structures. The decisive question now is, are these 3 nights merely a wave of escalation, or do they mark the beginning of a significantly larger Russian breakthrough? Welcome to our channel where we classify the most important international developments every day and illuminate the security policy background of current conflicts. The latest events in Ukraine have once again shown how quickly the military situation can change, especially when multiple frontline sections come under pressure at the same time. The focus at present is not only the intensity of the Russian nighttime attacks, but also the question of how resilient the Ukrainian defensive structures remain after almost 2 years of war. Above all, the combination of targeted strikes on energy facilities, the advance of Russian units in urban areas, and the increasing threat to central supply corridors gives the situation particular urgency. These developments raise fundamental geopolitical questions. How long can Ukraine hold its widely stretched front line if several sectors begin to falter simultaneously? What strategic intention is Moscow pursuing with this series of nighttime attacks? Is this a preparation for a new large-scale offensive? And above all, will international support be sufficient to provide Kyiv with stability during this critical phase? All these points are decisive for correctly assessing the events of recent days and understanding their possible impact on the further course of the conflict. On December 7th, the Ukrainian Air Force and several military analysis channels reported that Russia had intensified its nighttime attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure for the 3rd night in a row. The focus was again on the refinery near Kremenchuk, which has already been targeted several times this year. According to Ukrainian information, the refinery plays a key role in supplying the armed forces and is therefore repeatedly targeted by Russian precision strikes. At the same time, the situation along several frontline sections is deteriorating. The military analysis channel Military Summary reports that Russian units are advancing in multiple directions, including Seversk, Kostiantynivka, and parts of the Zaporizhzhia region. Particularly worrying is the situation in urban warfare zones, where Russian troops are said to be increasingly pushing forward into residential areas, resulting in intense house-to-house fighting. The Ukrainian army leadership emphasizes that the combination of continuous artillery and drone shelling, targeted attacks on energy infrastructure, and pressure along the entire eastern and southeastern front is pushing its own reserves to their limits. Meanwhile, air raid sirens were sounded in the greater Kyiv area, as well as in regions such as Kharkiv-Mykolaiv and Zaporizhzhia. Observers warn that the Ukrainian air defense is becoming increasingly overloaded, and that the repetition of coordinated nighttime attacks could lead to structural, long-term damage. The assessment from the frontline environment is clear: the situation is the most tense in months and raises the risk of local collapses of individual defensive lines. Experts also warn that the aim of Russia's nighttime attacks is not only tactical destruction, but also psychological impact. The continuous nighttime strikes are intended to disrupt Ukrainian command structures, put additional strain on logistics, and fuel uncertainty among the population. Against this background, a central question arises. Are these massive nighttime attacks part of a broader Russian winter strategy, or do they represent the beginning of preparations for a new offensive? The events of the past 3 nights can only be understood when placed in the broader strategic context of recent months. For weeks, Russia has been increasing both the frequency and intensity of its missile drone and glide bomb attacks, while simultaneously attempting to expand territorial control in certain frontline sectors. This dual strategy, long-range bombardment combined with localized ground advances, has been increasingly visible since autumn 2024. Historically, the refinery near Kremenchuk has been one of the most frequently attacked energy facilities in Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, Russia has repeatedly targeted refineries' fuel depots, transformer stations, and heating plants in order to restrict Ukraine's military supply capabilities. Kremenchuk plays a particularly important role because it is one of the few facilities capable of producing fuel in significant quantities for both civilian and military use. Repeated targeted attacks indicate that Russia is trying to disrupt the logistical backbone of Ukrainian forces on a long-term basis. Parallel to this, the frontline developments in Seversk Kostiantynivka and the Zaporizhzhia region reflect a pattern that has been visible since the summer. Russian units are attempting to advance slowly but continuously through the use of pressure points areas where Ukraine's defensive lines are overstretched or insufficiently fortified. Military analysts point out that Russia has been expanding the use of small assault groups supported by drones and artillery to gradually undermine Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainian army leadership has repeatedly warned that months of continuous fighting combined with the shortage of reserves and ammunition have weakened the ability to stabilize multiple threatened sectors simultaneously. This structural strain is one of the reasons why nighttime attacks have such a disruptive effect. They force the Ukrainian military to distribute its air defense resources over wide areas and react to different attack patterns. Another long-term factor is Russia's winter strategy. In previous winters, the Russian military has systematically attacked energy infrastructure to increase pressure on the civilian population and undermine morale. The most recent attacks suggest that Russia may be returning to this approach with the added objective of weakening Ukraine's logistical and operational capabilities at the front line. The broader geopolitical background also plays a role as international debates about Ukraine's future support intensify. Moscow appears to be testing how resilient Kyiv remains under simultaneous military, infrastructural, and psychological strain. The combination of these elements shows that the events of the past 3 nights are not isolated. They form part of a longer-term Russian strategy aimed at destabilizing Ukraine militarily, economically, and socially. At the military-technical level, the events of the past nights reveal a clear pattern in Russia's operational approach. Analysts emphasize that the combination of drones, glide bombs, and cruise missiles is aimed at overwhelming Ukrainian air defenses and exposing vulnerable sectors that can subsequently be exploited by ground forces. A key element is the use of drones in large numbers. They serve not only as attack weapons but also as reconnaissance systems that transmit data about Ukrainian defense reactions. This enables Russia to adjust subsequent attack waves and identify weak points in the defensive structure. The use of glide bombs in particular has intensified. These munitions are typically deployed from aircraft at high altitude, allowing them to hit targets far behind the front line with high accuracy. According to experts, this type of weapon is especially effective in urban areas because it can penetrate fortified structures. At the same time, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles are being used to target critical energy and supply infrastructures. By attacking the same facilities repeatedly, Russia forces Ukraine to use valuable resources for repairs while simultaneously weakening the stability of the energy grid. Another factor is nighttime timing. Nighttime attacks reduce visibility, complicate the operation of air defense systems, and place additional strain on Ukrainian command structures. The psychological pressure that results from repeated nighttime alarms affects both soldiers and the civilian population. On the ground, the tactics of Russian assault units are becoming increasingly visible. They advance in small groups supported by drones that correct artillery fire and identify weak points in Ukrainian positions. According to observations, these assault groups often attempt to infiltrate urban sectors and create footholds that can later be expanded into larger breakthroughs. Ukraine is trying to counter these developments through flexible defensive lines, mobile air defense systems, and the relocation of reserves. However, experts warn that the combination of increasing attack intensity and simultaneous pressure along several frontline sections represents a serious challenge. Overall, the operational situation shows that Russia is increasingly relying on a coordinated mix of long-range attacks and ground pressure, a strategy aimed at exhausting Ukraine militarily and destabilizing key supply structures. Internationally, the events of the past nights have triggered a wave of reactions, especially because the escalation occurs at a time when Ukraine's partners are already under political and economic pressure. In the United States, debates continue about the scope and duration of future support for Ukraine. Several political observers emphasize that the repeated Russian attacks on energy infrastructure show how dependent Kyiv remains on Western air defense systems. At the same time, some voices warn that the strain on U.S. resources and domestic political conflicts could limit Washington's ability to maintain current levels of support. In Europe, the nighttime attacks reinforce existing concerns. Countries such as Poland, the Baltic states, and the Czech Republic call for an expansion of military aid to Ukraine and warn that Russia is attempting to wear down Ukrainian defenses through systematic destruction of infrastructure. Within the EU, discussions are intensifying about long-term financial commitments, especially with regard to ammunition deliveries and support for Ukraine's energy sector. Germany and France have condemned the recent attacks, emphasizing that Russia is deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure to weaken both the population and the military's operational capability. Human rights organizations also expressed concern, pointing out that the destruction of heating and energy facilities during winter constitutes a serious humanitarian risk. Meanwhile, NATO observes the developments with growing attention. Alliance representatives emphasize that Russia's tactics show increasing coordination between long-range attacks and ground operations, a development that must be considered in future NATO planning. At the same time, NATO leadership highlights the importance of strengthening Ukraine's air defense, particularly against drones and glide bombs. Russia, for its part, presents the attacks as militarily justified and accuses Ukraine of using civilian facilities for military purposes, claims that are rejected by Kyiv and most Western states. International security analysts warn that the escalation of the past nights could be a sign that Russia intends to intensify its winter campaign. Several experts point out that the coordinated nature of the attacks indicates long-term planning aimed at gradually weakening Ukraine's ability to conduct effective defensive operations. Overall, international reactions show that the new escalation phase is viewed not only as a tactical development, but also as part of a broader strategic challenge that could shape political decisions in Washington, Brussels, and other capitals. The developments of the past nights open several possible scenarios that could significantly influence the further course of the conflict. In the worst-case scenario, Russia continues and intensifies its nighttime attacks, thereby causing long-term damage to Ukraine's energy infrastructure. If the refinery near Kremenchuk and other key facilities are repeatedly struck, Ukraine could face massive supply shortages, especially in terms of fuel, electricity, and heating. At the same time, the combination of glide bombs, drones, and ground assaults could overwhelm individual frontline sectors, leading to local collapses and forcing Ukraine to withdraw troops. Such a development would strengthen Russia's tactical position and further destabilize Ukraine's logistical system. A medium scenario assumes that Ukraine succeeds in stabilizing its defensive lines despite the pressure. Air defense systems could intercept enough drones and missiles to prevent catastrophic long-term damage, while mobile units rotate through threatened sectors to stop Russian advances. Nevertheless, the situation would remain extremely tense, and Ukraine would need additional Western support to maintain operational capability. In this case, Russia would achieve no decisive breakthrough, but Ukraine's resources would become increasingly strained. In the best-case scenario, Ukraine manages to significantly reduce the effectiveness of Russia's nighttime attacks, for example, through improved air defense coordination new systems or increased ammunition deliveries from Western partners. If Ukraine can stabilize the energy infrastructure and prevent further advances in Seversky, Kostiantynivka, and Zaporizhzhia, the immediate danger of a larger Russian breakthrough would diminish. Such a development would give Kyiv more time to reorganize reserves and strengthen defensive positions. However, experts emphasize that all scenarios depend heavily on external factors: the scale and persistence of Russian attack waves, the availability of Western weapons and air defense systems, and Ukraine's ability to quickly repair damaged infrastructure. The coming weeks will therefore determine whether the past nights were merely a phase of heightened escalation or the beginning of a broader Russian winter campaign aimed at systematically weakening Ukraine. The events of the past nights once again demonstrate how quickly the strategic balance in Ukraine can shift when military pressure, infrastructure destruction, and psychological effects coincide. The combination of repeated nighttime attacks advancing Russian units in several sectors and increasing strain on Ukrainian reserves marks a phase in which both operational and structural weaknesses are becoming visible. From a military perspective, Russia appears to be pursuing a coordinated strategy that involves simultaneously weakening Ukraine's energy infrastructure, overloading air defense systems, and exerting pressure on key frontline sectors. This multi-layered approach creates a situation in which Ukraine must react on several levels at the same time, a challenge that is difficult to manage, especially after months of continuous fighting. The psychological effect of nighttime attacks should not be underestimated either. Continuous alarms, explosions, and the uncertainty about which regions will be targeted next contribute to an atmosphere of permanent stress that affects not only the civilian population, but also command structures and frontline troops. At the same time, the international dimension of the conflict is becoming increasingly important. While Ukraine urgently needs reliable support from the West, political debates in Washington and within the EU are creating new uncertainties. For Moscow, this represents an opportunity to intensify pressure and test how resilient Ukraine remains under simultaneous military and political strain. The central question now is whether Ukraine can withstand this phase of escalation without losing decisive ground, or whether Russia will succeed in exploiting structural weaknesses to achieve breakthroughs at the front line. We will continue to monitor the developments. If you do not want to miss any of our analyses, subscribe to our channel, leave a comment, and share this video. Your support helps us continue reporting independently.